Hello, everybody, and welcome to this NorthStar Guides live Q&A. I'm Clinton Johnson. I use he, him pronouns, and I'm the president and founder of the NorthStar of GIS, and I'm joined today by my colleague, Chloe Tereslina. Chloe, I'll give you a moment to introduce yourself.
Hey everyone, my name is Chloe Tereslina. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. And I also support Clinton on the racial equity team. I'm happy to be here during this NorthStar Guides Q&A session today.
Cool. Chloe's going to put me on a hot seat, ask a bunch of questions that we've curated from a lot of people who had a lot of questions around the topic that we introduced this month called social identity. And before we get into that, I want to talk a bit more about what NorthStar Guides are and what we're doing through this whole NorthStar Guides program. But before I talk about NorthStar Guides, maybe I should first talk about what the NorthStar of GIS is, talk a little bit about our mission, why we exist, and what we actually do. So since 2017, we've delivered engaging events and workshops for over 2,000 guests, showcasing dozens of Black students and professionals sharing innovative solutions for business and social impact. And why do we do this? Well, for one thing, we found that there are just too few Black people involved in GIS, geography, and related fields. And those of us who are struggling to experience real racial equity. Before the NorthStar of GIS, there were times when I or other Black people in GIS could go for weeks without seeing other Black people in GIS. Even in our work that focused on topics like racial equity and social justice, we might be the only Black person at the table if we're even there. But why does it matter? Like, why does it matter who's doing this work and who's involved in geography and GIS? Well, GIS, or Geographic Information Systems, which is essentially mapping technology, bringing geography into dashboards that help you go beyond just looking at simple metrics or holistic views of what's going on. They help you understand the when and actually the where things are happening, who's having what kinds of experiences, and how to drive different outcomes in different locations. And every major city, every county with a major city, every state in the United States, governments all across the country have policymakers that are leaning heavily on GIS and geography as tools for understanding needs and for implementing policies and understanding the impact of policies. This impacts health services, public education services, and commercial services. And people from marginalized groups need to be involved in that work. That work involves our lives, our communities, our families, other people who look like us, and anti-racism and intersectionality need to be front and center. All too often, if it's involved at all, people think of it as something that you can do after the fact, tack on to the end. And the reality is, in societies and systems that are immersed in spaces, whether inside of your organization or around your organization, that are dealing with racial and other social inequities. We do not operate in a silo. And so work that is done that doesn't account for that wide range of disparities that's happening, and work that doesn't account for the other decisions that either your organization is making or others are making that impact the folks that you're trying to serve, without that lens of anti-racism and doing so with an intersectional perspective, very likely your next policy change, your next new service upgrade or deployment that impacts people in a community, either within an organization or around an organization, that next change is likely to create, sustain, or hide inequities, creating fertile ground for more injustice to perpetuate. So you need to make sure that decisions that you're making are being informed by mapping and analysis and data visualization that include anti-racism and that include a broad range of perspectives from people from the various Black communities that exist across the world, and folks from other marginalized racial groups need to also be involved in all of that work. So the NorthStar of GIS is dedicated to helping educators, leaders, and just everyday people advance intersectional anti-racism and increase belonging for Black people and for people of other marginalized groups. We leverage our lived experience, our GIS and STEM experience, and we combine all of that with our expertise in racial equity and social justice to create pathways towards sustainable diversity and sustainable belonging for people from all backgrounds. We believe that it takes more than just propelling people into new fields where folks will often end up isolated, alone, not very well supported, not finding themselves in environments that are intended to nurture them. We believe that it takes sustained support all throughout a person's academic, professional, and entrepreneurial pursuits. So we provide programs like the NorthStar Bridge, which supports Black students from historically Black colleges and universities, helping them to pursue their scholarship in GIS and geography, and particularly as GIS and geography relate to other disciplines. This year, we were happy to announce and identify 11 students to receive cash grants to help them pursue their studies, as well as participation in professional organizations like ERISA and the American Association of Geographers, who we've partnered with, as well as an organization called Blacks United Internationally Leading in Technology, to provide GIS and other skills-related workshops, all done in partnership with Tennessee State University, Fayetteville State University, Howard University, and Morgan State. Now, getting to NorthStar Guides and what NorthStar Guides really are. Well, NorthStar Guides is an education program offering positive practices for advancing intersectional racial justice, equity, and belonging. And by intersectional racial justice, we mean racial justice at the intersections of all other systems of oppression. We recognize that any work to advance equity, justice, or belonging must take into account multiple intersecting systems of oppression that harm people based on multiple intersecting identities. So NorthStar Guides includes a content library that's rich and filled with dozens of guides sharing foundational concepts, exploring barriers, and understanding and offering strategies for real impact. To help connect generic diversity, equity, and inclusion concepts with real experiences and challenges faced by people of color, and to provide effective guidance to help increase anti-racism and to increase belonging. In 2022, NorthStar Guides will introduce a training program with about 30 hours of workshops and activities to help leaders, educators, and again, the everyday person advance justice at work and in communities around the globe. We want to help individuals and institutions go well beyond performative gestures and to get to transformative changes. So follow NorthStar Guides to understand the fundamentals and to make connections between a lot of other JEDI, D&I, or DEI content that may just not go far enough to address intersectionality and anti-racism. So use NorthStar Guides to go beyond corporate jargon about pipeline building and get to a deeper understanding to better position yourself and your organization to really move the needle on anti-racism. And follow NorthStar Guides to gain strategies to increase justice in the workplace and in the community to ensure that Black people and people from other marginalized racial groups can really experience equity and belonging. Real culture change requires deliberate action to stimulate and to sustain equitable changes on your teams and throughout your organizations and communities. And NorthStar of GIS is your partner to help you get there. So we provide our patrons and sponsors with exclusive access to live events like NorthStar Guides Q&A sessions to explore our content in more detail. This gives you an opportunity to put us on the hot seat and ask us questions about what we really mean when we're talking about any given concept. And you can use as an opportunity to bring some of the challenges that you're facing, perhaps around conditions that you experience because of your how others and how systems react to your intersecting social characteristics, or to help other folks within your community, including the communities within your workplace and within your industry, to really find justice and belonging. And every month, our patrons and sponsors receive early access to a new NorthStar Guide. And that includes an infographic summarizing a key concept and a one-sheet brief that provides content and information that describes in a bit more detail what we mean by any given topic. So you can have this information handy with you when you're in the middle of a conversation and things get a little tough and you're trying to figure out, well, how do I describe what I'm experiencing, or how do I talk about a barrier that someone is facing, or how do I really describe a new strategy or take action to do something differently to advance equity or justice or belonging for someone within my organization, or for groups within my organization. So we hope that this content is going to fuel real change within your work. So this month, the concept was social identity. So I want to talk a bit about what that means, what social identity really means. And I'm sure you've heard terms like identity and social identity before. So we want to sort of focus in on what you need to know to understand social identity in the context of intersectionality and anti-racism. So social identity theory includes three processes, essentially. There's social categorization that feeds into social comparison, that feeds into social identification. There's this ongoing repetitive cycle that doesn't necessarily go from one end to the next, but includes lots of interacting and intersecting processes and interplay. So I'm going to talk a little bit about each one of these processes. So social categorization is essentially about describing and defining social groups based on social characteristics. So you can think of these whenever you see one of these circles from NorthStar in one of our graphics. What we're trying to describe is a social group or a social characteristic. And so you see some listed here like race and language or gender, education, where you live, where you work, where you play in terms of neighborhood, maybe your job role or classification. There's so many more groups that people build into different categories and start to identify. Social comparison is a process where people are compared to each other or to groups, or groups are compared to each other. And we can think about, the simplistic comparisons of maybe Black people as a group or a Black person as an individual to Asian people or to an Asian person, comparing men to non-binary folks or women, or comparing people from one school or who went to one school to people who went to a different school. All of these are types of social groups based on social characteristics. And then social identification is really about deciding who a person is based on intersecting social categories or intersecting social groups. So when you see this sort of graphic from NorthStar, what we're trying to describe here is intersectionality in a sense, right? So we're taking a wide variety of social groups intersecting in lots of different ways, and this includes social categories like religion or caste or disability status or age and Location is a core part of this, where your origins are from, where you live, where you play, where you worship, where you work. Socioeconomic background is a factor, race, ethnicity, indigeneity, and so many other factors are important when people begin to either identify who they are or identify who other people are. So when you're thinking about social identity, you can think about identities, intersectional identities like white women doctors, trans Asian men in Philadelphia, Black GIS professionals in Nebraska, working on projects related to social justice, right? Like all of these kinds of groupings come together. And in some ways, I'm sure you've thought about how um, social groups that you identify with create meaning for you, perhaps even when you're having conversations with others who maybe identify with other social groups. But certainly, while when we talk about social identity, this of course includes how we identify ourselves. And so sometimes I see myself as a person from Philadelphia, and someone might see themselves as a person from a different state. Um, I see myself as a technology professional in some ways, with a broad range of experiences from a variety of technical um, spaces. And but maybe other people sometimes really see me in a simplistic way. Sometimes people will, regardless of my actual age, will think of me as a young black man, and whatever that means to them, it means, or as a young man, or as a young person, whatever that means to them. So certainly, we might identify ourselves, but other people are identifying us too. So individuals may identify you, groups may identify you, and systems themselves, which really we can think of as collections of individuals, collections of processes, collections of technology systems that are that are taught with data derived from people, and programs and code defined by people to try to figure out who people are and how to treat folks. So now, after that overview of what the NorthStar of GIS is, what NorthStar Guides are, a quick overview of what social identity is and what that means. Now I'm gonna give Chloe time to just ask me questions about um, what social identity is, what it means, and so these are questions that we've curated from folks in advance.
Yeah, definitely. And the first question, kind of segueing off what you were just talking about, is can you talk about some times when social identity has mattered in your life?
Yeah, definitely. There have been times when, because of what I look like, people have decided that, either, I look too young to them to be involved in a conversation or to provide meaningful insight. And so, maybe I get ignored, or someone has decided that for whatever reason that maybe I don't have the expertise necessary for a given topic or challenge. And so in these situations, it makes it hard for me to be a strong contributor, and for those who may be impacted downstream by a given solution that I might be involved with. It may make it difficult for them to really get real benefit out of what could come from my participation. I'm sure that so many people have had similar situations when someone has just judged them before the fact, before really understanding what they can bring to the table, and why they may be there.
Yeah, absolutely. I definitely relate to that as someone who gets asked if they speak fluent English in the workplace. I think that that's something probably a lot of people here can also relate to. And then also, I guess going off of that, the next question we kind of have here is what does socioeconomic background mean as a social characteristic? Can you break
Yeah, so
that down further? What does that mean in the workplace?
yeah, I'll try to talk about that a bit. So when you think about socioeconomic background, People talk about that in a wide range of ways, right? So sometimes you'll hear people talk about um, educational background. So, what school did you go to? What how far did you go in the pursuit of your career? And what your household income is, or what a group of people's average or median income is. And sometimes socioeconomic background can be defined in terms of what adults in your household have what careers, and whether or not you own property, own own businesses in particular, maybe stocks, own houses. um, it can be about you as an individual, or a person as an individual. It could be about who's in the home, who's in the neighborhood, sort of defining for a whole community what their social economic background is. It could be, again, about things like where you are in terms of level within an organization. And certainly it could be about where a person is in the present, where they were in the past. And it can also be about transition. So sometimes I may think of myself as a person who lives in a middle income community, and sometimes I may think about myself as a person who grew up in a low income community, and sometimes I think about what it means to have experienced that transition.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's interesting because the things you mentioned seem pretty explicit, but often the way people find them out about you are a little bit more subtle, or I don't know if implicit is the right word, but I notice in the tech industry, for example, or in GIS, people will often try to subconsciously place your socioeconomic background by asking different questions like, oh, what part of this city are you from? Oh, you live in that neighborhood? Or, oh, you don't camp? Like things like that, where it's like they're trying to figure out where you fall in society's kind of hierarchy of economic means, whether they know they're doing it or not. And those are all just standard questions people get asked, and they're so normalized. But then if you say like, "Oh, I volunteer in East LA," people like whip their heads around and wonder why you would ever do that. And I think stuff like that says a lot. So speaking of that, our third question here is: can you talk about how location fits into all of this?
Yeah, you described a lot of it, right? Like sometimes whole communities get categorized into social identity groups, based on some presumption of either who is who makes up the predominant group, or sometimes, historically, when we think about redlining and racial covenants, and when we think in a contemporary sense about what happens when certain people walk by or drive through the neighborhood and they see Black or brown folks living their lives, minding their own business, and they maybe think that an area is sketchy, right? So, um, you know, so it could be about where you are, where you live, your places of origin, where you grew up. People may say that when they think about their social identity, that I'm from XYZ place. Maybe I was born and raised in a certain place, or my family is from a certain place, or I live in a certain place. And to your point, you also have all the people deciding those things about you by looking at you. Sometimes deciding, where you are from, sometimes deciding where you should live. I've definitely had conversations with coworkers when you know, starting to work on new teams. Someone might make suggestions about where I should live. Oh, no, no, that place is not for you. You're probably going to want to live in another place. And there's just so many different ways in which location is either important to us when we are defining ourselves, and therefore how it's important to other people who are defining who we are. Um, Sometimes they think for their benefit, and very often to our detriment.
Yeah, absolutely. And I feel like also people kind of forget how closely location is tied into community. There's a lot of times where I've heard people in professional settings really shame other people for where they live. And it's like, if if you think back to GIS topics like redlining, it's really no mystery why it's much more comfortable to be in one area versus another. So I guess that's another thing that kind of comes to mind on this topic. But I guess the next kind of question that we have lined up here is, what are some of the social characteristics that fall under the category more?
Yeah, we couldn't possibly list every single social characteristic that someone might think of as a group that they belong to or a group that someone else belongs to, assumptions about other people. But we definitely want folks to think about uh, topics like industry or trade or profession, right? Like your job level, your job type, the field that you're in. Sometimes, people are making decisions about, who they are in relation to others based on the job that they are in or the job that someone else is in, immigration status, or perceived immigration status that someone might derive from language. So when we think about language, think about the language a person primarily speaks, but also think about things like their accent, their dialect, or slang. And definitely think about how, as individuals, we decide when we may need to, I say decide, but oftentimes it's subconscious, when you may need to code switch in order to reduce the level of discomfort you may feel in any given space. Disabilities, whether visible or otherwise, right? People may move through the world with implants or allergies or diabetes. Some folks may be experiencing all people are experiencing different levels of mental health related concerns, and working through their own progress towards, positive mental health. Some folks may be neurodivergent. There are other topics like religion, spirituality, even atheism. And then there's, of course, sexual orientation and romantic orientation. All of these factors really come into play. And I was talking to someone over the weekend about the idea that maybe there are no safe spaces for people who have social characteristics that tend to be marginalized, people who find themselves in social groups that tend to be marginalized. And maybe the more intersecting social identities you have, that higher, the less likely it will be for you to find safety, regardless of what space you're in. Because even in a space where you are with people who look like you or who share your social group, we're all sort of socialized in these systems that can lead to internalized understanding and therefore internalized oppression of harmful messaging. So there's this hypervigilance that folks may find themselves in, that layers upon itself, maybe based on every marginalized social group that you may find yourself in, and how different you may find yourself from the group that you're in. So definitely think about the more dot 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 as being, um, you know, a lot more social characteristics than we could possibly name.
And it's probably also worth mentioning that all these social characteristics, they kind of vary by the context sometimes. Like you could be seen in one room as XYZ and then in another room differently. I was just reading an article about someone who actually has a physical disability, but part of the year, due to the type of clothing that they can wear, it's not visible to people. And she mentioned that she gets treated completely differently when people can see her part of her that is that where her disability is versus when it is completely covered up. People treat her with a lot more respect and they don't stare at her weird in public. So it's like there's different contexts too, where in some spaces you can be one thing or perceived one way and then perceived another way as well. So it's not like these are just set in stone and everyone sees you as exactly how you see yourself.
Right. And in some ways, I kind of want to talk about that as passing, and in other ways, it's just, it's just maybe in a given space, you're with more people who look like you or who just aren't focused on one of your social characteristics at the time. But then, I think about a time when someone said to me, we were on our way to an event that was focused on racial justice and inclusion, for people of color in tech in the Philly region, and this person um, said that it really bothers them when people suddenly realize where they're from. Um, this person probably passes as white in most situations, but then as soon as someone thinks about their last name or is told where they're from, or they mention, where they're from, the dynamic changes and suddenly discomfort increases. So there's so much to what you were just sharing, Chloe. I appreciate you for bringing that up.
There's it also makes you think of like the different levels of safety too, because I think it was there was like an account from Sylvia Rivera, who was a trans activist back in Stonewall, she mentioned that she has to make a choice. Would she rather be in black and brown spaces having to explain her trans and queer identity to people, or would she rather be in queer spaces having to explain her person of color experiences to people? And she chose the latter every time, just because personally it was easy for her. But I guess it kind of begs the question, to what you said earlier, are there safe places for people who have all those intersecting identities? Do you have to work a lot harder to find them? Because it sounds like you're always having to make these compromises. So there's a lot to consider when we say social identity.
Yeah, one of the things I think I learned from you, Chloe, was the importance of cultivating spaces where you can be completely authentic about um, who you are and the situations that you experience. And we all, we call that we call our experience of that racism question mark. Where we question our experiences with racism and question racism more broadly. We talk about, we try to pursue some healing and then talk about like what to do when it happens again, because it's going to happen again. It's never really a one-off. Um, yeah, so I think that that's also, really important as you are seeking safer spaces that um, I find that for those times I know I'm going to delve into spaces that are a lot less safe. And sometimes it's because I'm going to, talk about anti-racism, racism, um, um, or 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 social justice, intersectionality. Sometimes I'm just working, being and existing. Having other spaces that you can dive back into sort of feels replenishing to me. And the space that we call racism question mark is one that really replenishes me. So I would encourage folks to try to build those spaces for themselves and really tap into them.
Yeah, and if that is something that someone is looking for, there are a lot of spaces near you. They're probably just really small and you kind of have to dig for them, but it can really help you not feel so exhausted and drained, especially if a lot of the conversations you're having around equity take your energy from you. So definitely second that, finding a space that is safe. Probably, whether that's inside the workplace or not, somewhere where people can kind of get where you're coming from. And okay, so I think the next question we have here is, someone asked that we talk about how relationship status and family situations fit into this broader conversation about social identity. So can you talk a bit about that?
Yeah, so think about how important it is sometimes for some people to know or talk about whether another person is married or whether someone has children, like how fundamental sometimes that seems to certain social groups and certain social settings that you may be in, that someone may ask you about your assumed wife or husband or children. Um, think about the presumption of interest in those things. Someone just presuming that folks may be interested in pursuing relationships um, with a partner in general, or with a partner of some supposed or apparent opposite sex. Um, and all of the assumptions that seem to differ at different intersections of of gender, or um, all those assumptions that sort of are confined to heteronormativity. Um, and think about some folks who maybe have instead decided to be single parents by choice, deciding that they are going to adopt um, or give birth to children without a partner, um, and to pursue life in that way, or people who just simply aren't interested in pursuing romantic relationships for all number of reasons, particularly when we think about the broad range of romantic orientation, right? And then just think about how when you allow yourself to move past heteronormative assumptions, how those questions and conversations and assumptions impact people who are of the wide range of sexual orientations, and who have such a wide range of what family looks like in their home, right? So some of these things are really important to folks, right? Like people find, you know, being married themselves or pursuing marriage themselves to be really important. Um, but there are also people who are on a different end of that spectrum or anywhere in between. And all of that will really sort of land on different people differently, right? A lot of these presumptions are going to land on women differently, and what comes next when people make presumptions about whether or not a person will, of course, become a mother and therefore, of course, become, less available to do work. Those presumptions harm people in personal interactions, and they harm people in terms of their aspirations in school and work and entrepreneurship. So yeah, that's a really important topic to talk about, and I hope at some point we have a session where we drill in more intently, particularly around the broad range of sexual orientations and romantic orientations that we as a global collection of societies actually experience that really exist.
Yeah, definitely. And I feel like in assuming the relationship status or whatever their family situation is, I know that as someone who looks like me, people all the time ask me about who my boyfriend is or when I'm going to have kids. Like all these just radical assumptions that to me are just really unsettling because ultimately, in a professional setting or even with people you don't know, it's not something that you really want to discuss and they don't really know what the background is. And it's really ultimately none of their business. So it's always a bit uncomfortable when a coworker assumes something or someone you work with or have some kind of professional relationship with, and that it's like, do I really want to go into explaining this entire thing to them, or do I just go with it and then they always are assuming this incorrect thing about me? It adds a layer of inauthenticity where it's like you're definitely have that barrier between bringing your true self to whatever you're doing. And I'm sure that gets impacted more depending on what your identity is. But it's crazy to me that people just in today's age are still kind of just making all these assumptions that are really tied up into compulsory heterosexuality and all these things that we know have oppressed a lot of people for a long time. So it's definitely good food for thought on that, to not assume where people are coming from. And yeah, I'm glad that's one of the questions that we have. And so I guess the next question that we have here is, isn't social identity a person's individual choice? People choose their social identities.
So, as we walk through in the sort of the overview of social identity, so yes, and sometimes, and at the same time, not really. So yeah, we definitely make choices about who we are, um, and those choices are fluid, right? Like in any given moment, I think of myself as one thing, and then think of myself as something different at a different time. And maybe in some spaces where I feel safer, I'm more clear to others about I, who I who I choose to declare my identity to be, and in other spaces I maybe feel less comfortable and describe myself differently, and maybe even inhabit my body differently based on how I feel comfortable just defining who I am. And sometimes we at the same time, sometimes we start to make these choices about other people, and for other people will look at a person and just decide that, oh well, we know that person's Asian, or someone may say that they are Chinese, and then we may translate that into, oh, that person's Asian, right? And maybe the person who's declared themselves as Chinese doesn't think of themselves as this broad, all-encompassing Asian. Um, it's also like when people assume what a person's pronouns are, right? So the presumption that you can determine how a person wants to be referred to based on what you think they look like, and how that all changes as you move from different spaces and how it's changed over time. Or when a person mistreats or dehumanizes a person that they view as Black or African American or of some other marginalized racial group without actually knowing how that person identifies, right? So I've never really seen a police video where a Black person is being killed where the police have said, "Hey, pardon me, can you tell me how you identify?" Um, they are making choices about who they think a person is, what they think they can get away with, and what they think a person is about to do. Sometimes I've definitely been in places where someone has thought that I was the person they should throw their car keys to, um, or an interloper likely there to steal. I've gotten several greetings that begin with "You're on the wrong floor." "Oh, I'm sorry." Once understanding who I am, we've had some thefts. Um, and in a different session, we'll talk about like the implications of some of these things, stereotypes, stereotyping. Um, so, but for now, I want to really stay hyper focused on this presumption of identity before, going into what those assumptions and presumptions then mean about behavior or value. And then really like not really, right? So not really, we don't really get to identify ourselves all the time. Um, we're socialized really early in life. What we think of as man and woman, and what we think of as Black or African American or white, or some people say Caucasian. All of these are terms that people give us really early, right? Society tells us really early about these groups, and it tells us that we should choose, and sometimes it tells us what our choices are. Sometimes in that sense, society are our people in our household, our family, our people in our neighborhood, our friends, and sometimes it's people at school or in the workplace. Many people begin to socialize their children as boys or girls, even while they're in the womb or in the cradle. uh, Early in life, we are presented with so many categories for different types of characteristics. Family situation. Oh, you're going to grow up, and when you grow up and you get married, or oh, that is that person single or divorced or married. In the U.S., again, like when we think about race, people will project identities like Black and white and Asian, and oh, you're biracial. People think of some folks as educated or not educated, professionals or not professionals, and these are all many of these are categories. I'm sure that as you hear them, you're very familiar with them and have heard them before, and probably at some point when you felt like you were deciding who you were or who other people were, maybe it didn't occur to you that these were categories that were already defined for you, and therefore limiting what your choices are. I hope that helps.
Right. And ultimately, you're making some choices for yourself, but it sounds like, and a lot of those choices you're even making for yourself are limited by whatever economic, societal hand you've been dealt. But ultimately, people will perceive you in whatever way they see fit in that moment. So it's interesting how social identity, even if you make certain choices, the impacts of how you're being seen still fall on people's bodies really with really terrible outcomes a lot of the time. So yeah, I think that that's a really important aspect of social identity. When people say like, you picked this, you chose to be gay, you chose whatever, those that is an interesting point that people seem to always bring up, but the choices are kind of not really there most of the time. People will kind of make up their mind about what you look like to them and treat you accordingly.
Yeah, and then we just want to make sure that you all know that when we're talking about people choosing social groupings and choosing social identity, this is not about people choosing how they feel romantically or sexually about other people. That is just how they feel. Um, what we're talking about are these categories that people have predefined and societies have predefined, that we find ourselves being just, ever so consistently pushed towards choosing different categories, um, not choosing how we feel uh, about ourselves and about um, our interests in other people romantically or sexually.
There's a lot to be said too in those categories for all the people who are in between categories or who might feel like they might are in some kind of gray area. What category do you technically fall into? Because society is all about the categorization and breaking people out into these groups, but how do you actually put yourself into one of those groups? Like, what if you feel oppressed by the LGBTQIA plus community, but you identify as non-binary? Like, do you technically fall into that category? Maybe, I don't know. Like, do you feel like that resonates with you? I feel like there's just so many interesting nuances to the topic of categorization as well. I feel like we could talk about this all day.
Yeah, definitely.
um, but since we can't, I think the next question that we have here is, can you talk about what's coming next from NorthStar Guides?
Definitely. So, over the next couple of months, we're going to be talking about stereotyping, racialization, and racial identity. All of these are really interesting topics that needed us to first talk about social identity. You're going to see in our infographics building upon, some of what you see from social identity. And the very next topic is stereotype, and we talk about stereotype as a verb and as a noun. Um, then we're going to start sharing insights about belonging. Then we're going to share some information about common barriers that stand in the way of equity. You saw maybe a screenshot of some of those barriers. And then we're going to start talking about strategies that people can use to overcome those barriers and ensure that um, folks from their intersectional um, identities can find belonging in spaces wherever they are.
Okay, that's awesome. That's a lot to look forward to. Super exciting stuff going on. And then for that, is there a way to get access to NorthStar Guides earlier?
Yeah, so all of our all of our all access patrons and above on our Patreon site, they get early and exclusive access to content like this live Q&A, to see and when it's live recording, or to experience, after the fact, and all of that content is always available for folks to ask more questions and to engage. And NorthStar of GIS is developing institutional pricing to give people, ready access to all of our content, to help them tap into the resources in our complete library, not just the stuff that we've released to the public, and give people some access to some limited consultations for justice, equity, and belonging, and diversity and inclusion work. For now, there is a new institutional license or institutional patron level for those organizations that want to help us invest in NorthStar, invest in our capacity to build out a strong educational program, and folks who become patrons at that level after the first 6 months of their membership, of their patronage, they will get access um, to one of our workshops when they become available in 2022.
Awesome. I think that's all the questions that we have for you. So I'll let you wrap things up.
Yeah, thanks, Chloe. I really appreciate you participating in this event, and appreciate the patrons and everybody else for coming together and to learn more about this topic. It's really important for folks to understand all of these different pieces of of the puzzle, right? Like, you need to understand some of these things a little better so you can have a more effective conversation, or when you see something happening, you can dissect it a little more easily, a little more quickly. And we just want to make sure that folks have access to all of this content that they can. We definitely want to thank all of our sponsors and our patrons for supporting us, and just be on the lookout for more content. So we'll see you next month with more content from our Patreon platform for folks who want early and exclusive access to content. And we'll see you at the next live Q&A. Take care. Thanks again, Chloe.
Thanks.